I don't imagine I'll actually speak for 45 minutes. So what I'm hoping to do is talk through some of the issues that I'm raising and some of the theory, so I hope you'll bear with me, and then raise some interesting questions that are much more generally applicable. So to give you a sense of where I'm coming from, my work is in rhetoric and the rhetoric of science, which I know there are lots of English folks, so I don't really need to explain it too much to them, but essentially what this tells you is I'm not a game studies scholar per se. I'm kind of coming at games from another discipline, so forgive any errors that I make in terms of the actual kind of field of game studies and how I articulate and position what I'm doing. What I'm really interested in is how knowledge production is shaped by how we write and communicate. And this is kind of the business of rhetoric of science, right? So we say that scientists argue, they argue particularly well, and that tells us something about how we can come to find certain sorts of knowledge through argument and argumentation. And the kind of application of this in a lot of ways is how can we produce better knowledge, right? How can we get more people involved in producing knowledge? How can we make it easier for novice scientists to be enculturated into a field and contribute to production of scientific knowledge? But I'm also interested in kind of the business of who gets to count as a scientist anyway? So at what point do we start looking at, say, graduate students as scholars, right, as scientists as opposed to kind of students figuring stuff out? Can we look at non-scientists who gain expertise as functioning scientists, as sort of amateur scientists? And this is where this whole business of citizen science comes in. So I've been studying citizen science for a while now, and it's the kind of focus on involving new stakeholders and participants that I'm really interested in looking at, because that changes the kinds of conversations, the kinds of discourse we have around scientific subjects and topics and problems. And the kind of crux of rhetoric is, you know, it's people talking to people, right? So when you add a bunch of new people in, it changes the dynamics. So citizen science is likely to change these dynamics of scientific knowledge production in interesting ways. So citizen science is sometimes referred to as public participation in scientific research, crowdsourcing of science, and essentially what it means is you have some non-experts who are participating in solving some kind of scientific problem. So one of the oldest examples is the Christmas bird count. And essentially this is folks go out and sort of take an inventory of what sorts of birds are around. And this has been going on for over 100 years in North America. Galaxy Zoo as a collection of projects, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So you have things like, say you want to sort galaxies by their shapes, right? So it's actually computationally very difficult to do. So you have hundreds of people sort through these images and figure out what kind of galaxy this is. So these are the kinds of projects that have been really successful, and essentially they're data collection or data sorting projects, and they use this massive number of people to get through large quantities of data very effectively. So there are kind of two types of citizen science, though. And what we often think of are the top-down kinds of citizen science. So that is led by a scientist, right? So you have a project, you enlist a bunch of people to help you with your project. And the Christmas bird count or the Galaxy Zoo projects are kind of examples of that. And also Fold It, which is what I'm going to talk about today. The other kind of citizen science you have, which I'm actually much more interested in all of my work up until this point has been there, is kind of bottom-up citizen science. So this is grassroots science. And my favorite example is SafeCast, which is an organization that formed after the disaster at Fukushima Daiichi. And essentially what they said was, you know, you have a bunch of researchers parachuting in, collecting data, and we don't know what happens to it. Nobody's got it. No one can provide it to us. The Japanese government provided a publication of data readings in a PDF, which is pretty useless, right, if you actually want to use data. So SafeCast is this collection of non-experts who came together, found experts in different areas, and built what they call Geiges, which are essentially a bento box form factor device with a Geiger counter, an Arduino, and GPS device, and they would collect all of this data, drive around, sort of take readings, and then upload it online into a freely open database. So some questions arise, of course, about measuring radiation contaminations really hard. How do non-experts do it? But it turns out they're really effective at this, and their data is actually really good. It's some of the best that's out there, and it's been used by the Fukushima prefecture, and they were invited to the IAEA, which is the big international atomic energy sort of consortium, to talk about what they've been doing and how they've been collecting this data and how they're kind of taking into account all sorts of problems that folks are encountering, like measuring water or measuring food. So, so both of these kinds of citizen science can be really valuable, and I think they're really interesting, and I think using games to further some of this is actually a really important way to think about how we can get sort of a number of people involved in a structured way to sort through or collect or vet data. So this is where the citizen science and game stuff comes in that I'm interested in. Now, citizen science and games is sort of one area that I'm interested in. I'm interested in science games more broadly, and last week, I sort of talked about these different areas, and I said, you know, there's kind of citizen science in games, there's disaster preparedness, risk training, that sort of stuff, environmental education, disaster recovery, decision support, science education, kind of broadly. And I had a few questions afterwards about, you know, sort of why I'm setting aside health and that sort of thing. And essentially it's just, I'm interested in this stuff, and lots of people talk about health in really smart ways. So I'm setting that aside for now to sort of focus on these other games that I think I can actually add something to. But in all of these, citizen science sort of stands out because for the most part, these games are about education, and citizen science games aren't just about education, though that's certainly part of it. They're also about actually producing knowledge, new knowledge. So I'm particularly interested in that area for that reason, because, you know, that's my shtick, right? I'm interested in the production of scientific knowledge. So one venture that I've looked at is Fold It, which, how many of you are familiar with Fold It? Okay, most folks. So Fold It is an online science game from the University of Washington that enlists people to help solve puzzles that correlate with protein folding and kind of the possibilities for best outcomes of protein folding. And the game designers hypothesized essentially that human beings were going to be superior to their computational approaches to these problems. And they're right. Humans were better at this. So what the game does is essentially use a network model to have numerous players trying to figure out how protein structures should be folded. And essentially what happens is, you know, they sort of figure out these strategies about how the protein structures should look, and they send this back to the scientists, and the scientists actually build these proteins and see if it works, right? So initially they had some problems. It wasn't working very effectively, but the players started to organize to figure out better strategies to get better outcomes. And since then, it's been an enormously effective process at actually figuring out real protein structures. So I guess what I want to kind of point out broadly is that the human players become absolutely essential to solving these problems in a reasonable amount of time and effort. And part of what's going on there is the game designers are harnessing their agency, right? Their ability to act and figure problems out in the world. So what I'm drawing this from is an article I wrote with Kate Madalena, who's at UNC Wilmington, and we essentially talk about this. So the article is in Proi, which is kind of a rhetoric of science journal. So we talk a lot about actor network theory, Latour, and genre, and that sort of stuff. And I'm going to gloss that today, but I won't bog anybody down with it. But essentially, in the article, what we're talking about is that there's this sort of new kind of discursive ecology unfolding in the game. And what I mean by that is that there's a whole apparatus around the game that allows us to understand how people are working towards producing new knowledge. And that's kind of where we're interested as opposed to the game mechanics themselves. So I'm going to talk mostly about these kinds of discursive ecologies that happen around games than, say, the player mechanics. So this is just a wallpaper because I'm going to kind of talk through some stuff, but I thought it looked pretty neat and I wanted an image. So you can get that on the Foldit website. I suppose I can say, when we first sent this paper out, the kind of reaction we got was, well, why aren't you actually looking at the game? So, which is fair to an extent. But what we wanted to do was focus on the game environment and the kinds of text that happen around the game itself that allow it to function really efficiently. Because it wasn't just the game that allowed this whole project to be really successful. It was people organizing around it. So we really wanted to kind of take a different approach in that way. And we also wanted to look at these as genres. And I suppose I'll have to say a bit about genre to clarify kind of what I mean by that. But essentially what we're interested in looking at is how the citizen science community with this heterogeneous group of individuals comes together to form a kind of coherent community through texts that they use. So genre theory is essentially just, in most cases, take out whatever idea of genre you have and set it aside for now, because that's not what I mean. What we mean when we talk about rhetorical genre theory is essentially a reaction to kinds of literary theories of genre, which is a top-down taxonomic approach, right? So you kind of slot stuff in as whatever kind of genre you identify it as, right? Fantasy versus sci-fi, that sort of stuff. We don't do that. We're sort of saying instead, rather than looking at how we can classify genres either by commercial purposes or literary forms, we want to look at how people actually use them, right? So a good example is patient intake forms. So when you go to the doctor, right, the doctor has this kind of recurring exigence. There's a human being here and they want you to do something because they feel sick or hurt or whatever. So the way the community of experts handles this, the doctors and nurses, is they kind of develop text to deal with this, right? Recurrent text, so the patient intake form. So every time a patient comes in, they use this form. So we talk about typified rhetorical actions based in recurrent situations, which is a bit to unpack, but essentially what that means is you always have your patient intake form when people come in, and they're the recurrent situations, right? So when we talk about genres, what we're really talking about are bottom-up structures that communities of people use to organize themselves in efficient ways. And when we talk about genres online, we kind of run into some trouble because the idea of a genre is it's something you can identify. It's got some stable features, some structure, right? So you can look at a patient intake form and say, that's a patient intake form. So we would say that's an instantiation of the genre. But when you look at some online forms, it's a lot harder to figure out if it's a genre or just kind of the platform, right? And the classic case of this was blogging. So a bunch of people early on wrote about, including Dana Boyd, is the blog a genre, right? Well, not really, because it's sort of speciated into a bunch of different genres. So what we learn from that isn't that, you know, we should just toss out genre theory and it's not useful. It's that these things change over time. So when we look at these different text types, we're seeing some of that change occurring. Okay, so the other kind of theoretical framework that we use that I'll just sort of gloss is called actor network theory. And actor network theory is a product of Bruno Latour, so it's kind of science studies, STS, rhetoric of science, that sort of stuff. And essentially what this says is instead of just looking at text in human beings, let's look at all of the actors and elements in a situation and give them all kind of the same treatment that we would give a human being, say, right? So rather than focusing on what the human's doing, we look at all of the elements in a particular situation. And this is essentially a good balance to the rhetorical approach, which is really focusing on human beings. But I won't go too far down that rabbit hole, so I'll just kind of leave it there saying actor network theory likes to look at network components, and they're all important. And genre theory focuses on humans and human texts. So when we talk about genres in science, we kind of get this weird breakdown, which is persistent across almost anybody talking about science communication. And that's we have expert and internal discourses. So these are research articles, conference presentations, abstracts, lectures, right? all this sort of stuff that happens among scientists or among academics. And then we have non-expert stuff, right? So these are the Cosmos, the Carl Sagans, the popular articles in books, right? The selfish gene, that kind of stuff. We all talk about this as kind of a popular genres of science communication. But there's a lot of other stuff going on, particularly as we see new ways of gathering together to create knowledge, like citizen science. So we can kind of talk about what folks have called parascientific genres. So these are genres that operate in a kind of intermediate space between the expert or internal and the non-expert. And that's to say something like a trade magazine, right? So, you know, debating what kind of flavor of nanotechnology you're going to frame your discipline as. It's not necessarily in a kind of peer-reviewed form, but it might be opinion pieces in a trade journal. What I like to talk about are trans-scientific genres, and that's what my book talks about. And essentially, I'm borrowing this term from Alvin Weinberg, and he talked about trans science, right? And this is essentially a whole business of risk communication. How do you actually figure out all the risks for, say, a nuclear plant? You can't. Some of them are trans-scientific problems. Science can answer, but we don't have the resources, time, money, etc. But what I talk about are the genres that are emerging that sort of don't operate within any of these frameworks. So these genres allow different kinds of experts and non-experts and someone in between expert and non-expert, that sort of spectrum, to communicate their findings and, more importantly, not just communicate their findings, but actually vet each other's work and build on their work and build better methods. So these are things like science blogs, crowdfunding proposals, that sort of stuff that I'm really interested in. And in that, I would include things like games for science and the apparatus, all the text and conversations that occur around that. So when we look at Fold It, I'm going to talk about sort of two types of genres. There's sort of top-down, and there's also bottom-up genres. And essentially, this means kind of the traditional genres, and then what I would call trans-scientific. Top-down essentially means we have these sort of research articles, conference proceedings that come out of the project, right? And they're really, really kind of traditional forms of publication. And then we also have an apparatus within the site itself that structures the way people are going to interact with all of the content, from the game to the help pages to that sort of, to the sort of information they'll get to understand what the project's about. And those are essentially structured by the scientists running the project, because Fold It is, of course, one of these kind of overall top-down citizen science projects. So when we think about the homepage, for example, it functions as this kind of portal, right? So it's shaping how the community of users will initially see this project, how they'll understand it, and it contains all kinds of elements which direct people to become involved in certain ways. And tell them about what kinds of work will be valued and how it's important to conduct this work. And then we also have sort of this other stuff going on that I'm mostly going to ignore for today, but you know, you have credits for designers and all this sort of stuff, right? All the kind of apparatus that tells you this project is run by experts. So we have a lot of interesting work that goes on in terms of establishing credibility, right? Which even just being affiliated with the University of Washington is pretty good at. So in addition to these kind of top-down structuring text types, we have bottom-up genres, and these are, I think, what are really interesting. And I'm just going to focus on recipes in Fold It. And essentially, these are procedural strategies that help people figure out how to fold the proteins better. So how they can actually get those proteins folded in such a way that it'll be a real thing you can create in the world, a real protein. So these are player-negotiated genres. So these are crafted by the actual players of the game in these communities to figure out how to do their job better. And essentially what we saw was the users wanted this space to kind of organize themselves and create these strategies. And it allows them to have kind of ownership over the social actions they're participating in, right? The kind of knowledge construction that they're participating in. And it allows them to negotiate among what we might call non-experts without the kind of constraints and oversight of the expert community telling them how to do this, which is probably not surprising to anybody who studies games, right? Because there are always these kinds of background structures that go on that allow for different sorts of interaction or even knowledge production. So what's particularly interesting when we look at these recipes from kind of the genre and rhetoric perspective is that they become fairly typified in terms of how people are talking about strategy and problem solving and the kinds of language that you end up seeing in this. And what you see is people really become experts in strategy, right? In methods, essentially, for scientific research. So they're not just sort of playing a game or, which I'm sure I don't have to sell anybody on here, but you know, they're not really just playing a game. They're really genuinely involved in the scientific process and creating scientific knowledge. And they generate not only the kind of content we see in the recipes, but actual products of science when they have successful protein folding strategies. So where I kind of talk about agency in this is that when you have these top-down approaches, the agency of players is somewhat restricted, right? You're essentially setting up some constraints that they have to operate in. And this is really traditional in lots of scientific research and traditional citizen science. And where we see this still playing out and fold it is in authorship of research articles, right? And this has lots of reasons, particularly tenure-stream faculty want to publish articles so they get tenure, right? Postdocs want to publish so they get jobs, this sort of stuff. But that has kind of serious implications, I think, which I'll come back to when we actually start enlisting citizen scientists who are doing a lot of the kind of on-the-ground work of knowledge production. So the kind of result from publishing an article, which Foldit does with the scientist authors, and then sort of a acknowledgement of, say, the 100 people who played for this protein fold or whatever, is that you render invisible all of those players who had this enormous agency and this enormous role in constructing that knowledge, right? And this tells us a lot of important stuff about the way people get excluded from scientific knowledge production when it goes out into the scientific community, right? So while they did a lot of this work on the ground, they engaged in really authentic, important ways, we don't really see that played out when we look at the pages of journals. So when we just look at traditional scientific venues to try to understand what science does, we don't really get a full picture of what's going on, right? We get sort of the output, the final product, which has a story that's not really the story of science. And indeed, when we kind of look at these non-traditional genres, these non-traditional outputs and processes, what we see is that there's considerable agency by the players, right? They're actually really important to all of this, and it tells an important story about who's doing this kind of work and who's actually producing knowledge. And the business of agency is essential because in rhetoric we talk about agency as this kinetic energy of rhetorical performance, which essentially means you do stuff in the world with language and communicating and words and argument, right? So for rhetoric, the kind of rhetorical performance here is really important because it tells us a lot about how knowledge is really being produced. So, so the questions that I have kind of lingering about this are, you know, if we have these players with lots of agency and they're generating scientific knowledge, what happens when we do restrict them, right? What kinds of knowledge production strategies are we excluding? But then at the same time, are these structural conditions essential to the production of their agency, right? Do they need this whole top-down apparatus to actually do something? And I would say no. Because although they don't have a game, Safecast is a good example of how without any structure they were able to do a lot of the same work in terms of scope of data collection and importance of data. And then, you know, is this attribution of research articles proportional to the products of their agency, right? So are we giving fair attribution to the people involved in these projects? And how would you give attribution anyway, which is a huge problem when you have, say, 1,000 players. And Foldit is addressing this, and they kind of consider these issues to ensure they're fair, right? And a big part of academia and science, of course, is fair attribution to all of those involved in the production of knowledge. Although, of course, that doesn't always play out, as various sorts of studies of graduate work in the sciences tell us. So this is where I turn to kind of what I'm interested in doing in the future. So this was my very early work, and also a shameless plug, which is where I just, talk about what I talked about last week. And so I'm really interested in these problems for science games, and I think they apply broadly. So a few of us have been trying to get this Science Games Hub thing started. And essentially what we're interested in doing are collaborating with researchers on game-based learning and approaches to figure out how to not just, educate people or get science to the public, but produce better scientific knowledge, right? How do we do this in the best ways we can? And also, how do we extend sort of science communication and promote better understanding of science, which is kind of what I'm interested in. So what we've been doing is we're working on a wiki, which has nothing in it yet, mapping the genres that are at work, mapping mechanics, and developing partnerships. So if anybody's interested, please join us. Thank you. So there's often a lead, and sometimes they get credit for the project, but part of the problem is it's a process, right? So usually what happens is you try a bunch of different folds and they don't work, so a bunch of people are trying a bunch of different folds that don't work, and then eventually, after all those failures, you get one that does, right? So one did solve it, but on the failure of others, right? Which is, I mean, kind of science broadly, right? A bunch of people try some stuff and it doesn't work, and someone builds on that. So yeah, so you do kind of get those cases, but it's never quite as clean as just this one person is totally responsible, at least that I've seen.
I was thinking sort of the gamification of that is maybe that, and I haven't tried Foldit, so I don't know exactly what but like saying, if you had the idea that whoever, I don't know, the top 5 scorers or someone who makes the breakthrough, that could be part of the reward, is that if you are in the top folders or you're in the top people who solve things, that those people are acknowledged somewhere, that you can't do 1,000, but you could do the 5 key people in a particular project, and that could be a reward in itself.
Absolutely.
I not only played the game, I got mentioned in a scientific paper, which could be rewarding.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they do some of that, but I'm not sure exactly how much they've broken it down that way, but they do publish with some of the more involved folks. Yes?
I was just wondering, how is the scientific community itself reacting to these games? Are they embracing it? Are they still making a little bit of resistance?
So, yeah, that's a good question. So, games aren't really the issue. The issue is involving non-experts, right? Okay. So they're still really skeptical about that. I think in some ways games alleviate fears because you have a clear structure and it's clear what they're doing. So whereas when you have these messier sort of citizen science projects that don't have those structures, you don't really know exactly how they're doing it or what they're doing, right? You can't spell it out. So in some ways, I feel like the games help address some of the issues of how citizens are going to be involved in these projects. So in the case of citizen science broadly, you get these conversations about, is the data any good that they collect, right? But when you have a game that's providing the data and they just sort of need to work with it, you toss aside that question. In terms of data quality, the quality of their data analysis, in the case of Foldit, they have a really good mechanism, which is we just make the protein and see if it works, right? So they kind of have a vetting process that's maybe a lot I don't want to say easier, but clearer in some ways than something like Galaxy Zoo or some of these systems that just use sorting of different data, because then you have to provide, multiple cases of people vetting the same data to try to get some accuracy. So to answer more briefly, yes, there's some issues in terms of how they understand participant involvement, but I do think games are actually a really good strategy to address some of that, because you're providing structures that allow people to see clearly what's going on from the outside. But at the same time, talking about it that way can also, so I just want to qualify as I do what I said and say that, the looser structures doesn't mean it's not as good data, right, or as good work. It's just harder sometimes. You actually have to go back and look at the methods and sort of figure out what's going on. But yes, lots of concerns about data quality, the data production, data analysis, all of that is certainly going on. But in the case of Foldit and lots of other citizen science projects more broadly, not just games, the proof is kind of in the quantity of data and the kind of research they can do, right? So if you can get some funding, which these folks have been able to do, and publish some papers in the academic community, that essentially gives you the credibility that you need. And certainly being affiliated with a university gives you the credibility that you need, as I'm sure this institute has done, right? This is lots of credibility here. So yes, I do think, and I talked to some folks who were working on these kinds of games at MIT, and they said, it is the same problem that you run into with, say, social sciences research, right? That you're kind of getting a self-selection of people who have time to do this, which is a luxury in itself, right? And oftentimes, what you do see is, yes, there's time, there's money, there's demographic breakdowns you would expect, that kind of thing. So it's, the number of voices that you end up getting aren't perhaps as diverse as the language suggests, right? And you do see a breakdown, I don't know about in science games in particular, but in citizen science in particular, where there's citizen science run by universities, right? So you clearly get a lot of the structures of knowledge already shaped in ways that are going to be fairly traditional. We ask certain kinds of questions for certain kinds of disciplines. We care about certain kinds of problems and not others. So there's already that selection stuff, which will go on with games, right? Who's developing them, who's putting them out there, who thinks it's a valuable game. And then what you also see, so then you have your players or citizen scientists or what have you, and they kind of work within this apparatus, and that's fine, and hopefully you have some diversity, but that's certainly been an issue. But then you also have the other side of citizen science, which is what I was initially interested in, which is sort of environmental justice movements, where they do a lot of the same work, and they put in the same kinds of approaches to methods and problem solving and data collection, and it is summarily dismissed because you're typically looking at demographics that are going to be summarily dismissed by figures of authority, right? So poor, rural, you name it, and their data gets ignored. And part of that, I think, which is where I like to, address the whole issue of credibility and ethos and all this stuff, is their data is good, the other folks' data is good, but people are still believing this data more because it's got all of this apparatus or all of these people around it that have credibility already. So, and that's why I'm sort of always cautious about talking about how good the quality of vetting data is and that sort of stuff, because a lot of this ends up just being kind of veiled discourse to say, I don't care about your data. So there's lots of projects that have, say you've got a toxic plant spewing crap out right near your home, and nobody cares about it because you live in rural Mississippi. So people go out and they collect the data, right? And then people who have authority, so whether they're policymakers, legislators, regulators, scientists, sort of say, well, how'd you do this? What were your methods, et cetera, et cetera. These folks try to work with them to do better data collection, but they just sort of say, well, it's not, this isn't how we do it. It's not real data collection. Where I think there's some interesting work is groups like SafeCast, which I probably shouldn't study because I'm just a cheerleader for their group, but they've been moving into using their monitoring devices and building different kinds of monitoring devices to get baseline readings for larger areas. So if you look at, say, the EPA in the United States, they take air quality readings on kind of a 12 by 12 grid, right? Which is fine. But Safecast is interested in going into certain areas and getting much granular readings. So if you think about somewhere like LA, right, you get really significant changes over a very small area because you have things like an airport or different districts with factories and that kind of stuff. And so what they're interested in doing is collecting all of this data and providing it freely to the public. Now the EPA does too, but there's also, as soon as you get into this, right, so I've got data, I've got good science, you still got to share it with the community in the way they understand it, right? And right now, the way a lot of organizations release data, it's just not useful to people. So they can't figure it out, or they're not online. And in the case of Safecast, they're really interested in better ways to represent data. So things like, how do you tell someone what a baseline for radiation exposure should be? Because I mean, we're all exposed, right? But you don't think about it. So how do you tell people what's normal and what's scary? So they're doing a lot of work like that, which is absolutely essential to making any of this relevant. And I think the nice thing about moving some of this work into game-based environments is people creating games are already thinking about these problems, right? Of data representation, meaning of data, how you actually convey this stuff to people. So I think there's a really nice link and potential there for addressing these in important ways. But fundamentally, you kind of run up against the problems of it's sort of a luxury engagement, right? And I'm not sure, I mean, I have no solution to that, but I guess being mindful of that's important. Well, I think part of what is fun about rhetoric of science, right, is that, I mean, our whole business, we sort of do the, well, is it objective, right? How is it, what do you mean by objective? Which fundamentally what it comes down to is they argue really well, right? So you don't, I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, but you don't get bullshit passed, right? So it's a good vetting process for argumentation, but that's not always objectivity in kind of the purest sense of objectivity. So I think there's lots of room, especially with games, to show that, you know, part of this is really just about really good argument, and games can be really good persuasive arguments, and framing it that way is hopefully persuasive. I don't know, I work with lots of scientists and they seem to like me, so I guess I'm not saying anything too outrageous. Well, I think it's fun too when you can talk about, you know, once things move up to the level of policy and how do you talk to folks and how do you actually, because I mean, fundamentally, science has a pretty severe PR problem, right? And maybe not so much in Canada at this point, but in the United States, I worked with people on nano, genetic engineering, you know, climate change, kind of the checklist of things that people are going to find really contentious. And a lot of it is just not understanding what exactly the science is doing, why hedging's important, all this sort of stuff, right? Which, and I'm sort of secretly a ruthless positivist, right? So I think absolutely this is the way we make knowledge, but I think communicating that out through different venues, whether they're games or different forms of science communication, is absolutely where lots of scientific work needs its help, right?